Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it wears a tailored suit and a smirk, sitting in a dim restaurant booth, playing games with people's livelihoods. Roman Castiglione thought he was untouchable. He thought asking an exhausted waitress how to restructure a multi-million-dollar offshore portfolio was a hilarious joke, a quick way to put the working class in their place for his friend's amusement. He wanted to see her stammer. Instead, she picked up a napkin, borrowed his pen, and dismantled his entire empire in 3 minutes. The air inside Bistro Laura tasted like white truffle oil and expensive regret. Nora Gallagher balanced a silver tray on her left palm. Her feet ached, a dull, throbbing pain radiating from her arches up to her calves, the result of a double shift on polished hardwood floors. She kept her face blank. In this restaurant, invisibility was a required skill. You didn't listen to the hushed conversations. You didn't look too closely at the briefcases exchanged under the tables. You definitely didn't make eye contact with the men in the private dining room at the back. Unfortunately, Table 82 was her section tonight. She pushed through the heavy velvet curtain. The back room was stifling, thick with cigar smoke that the ventilation system was struggling to pull away. 4 men sat around the circular mahogany table. 3 of them were heavy-set, wearing suits that looked slightly too tight, radiating a nervous, aggressive energy. Then there was the man at the head of the table, Roman Castiglione. He didn't look like a thug. He looked like an aristocratic bored heir, all sharp cheekbones, dark, slicked-back hair, and a bespoke charcoal suit that probably cost more than Nora's tuition debt. He was twirling a heavy crystal glass of Macallan, watching the amber liquid catch the low light. He wasn't speaking. He didn't need to. The other 3 men were falling over themselves to fill the silence. "It's a liquidity issue, boss," a bald man with a sweating forehead was saying. "The feds are tightening the net on the import companies. We can't move the cash from the warehouse front into the legit accounts without triggering a structural audit. It's too much volume." Roman finally looked up. His eyes were pale, an unsettling shade of grey that gave nothing away. "So you're telling me we have 12 million sitting in a damp basement, losing value to inflation because you don't know how to fill out a ledger?" "No, Roman, I'm saying..." "You're saying you're useless." Roman set the glass down. The soft clink sounded like a gunshot in the sudden silence. Nora approached the table, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. She set a plate of Wagyu carpaccio in the center of the table, followed by fresh oysters. She didn't tremble. She didn't shrink. She just did her job. Roman leaned back in his leather chair. He was frustrated, surrounded by idiots, and deeply, violently bored. His gaze drifted away from his sweating accountant and landed on Nora. She was wiping a drop of condensation off the mahogany. She wore the standard uniform, black slacks, a crisp white button-down, hair pulled into a tight, no-nonsense bun. There were dark circles under her eyes. She looked like exactly what she was, a girl working for hourly wages, surviving on caffeine and sheer willpower. A cruel, idle thought sparked in Roman's mind. He wanted to embarrass someone. He needed a distraction from the incompetence of his own men, a quick hit of superiority to break the tension. "Excuse me," Roman said. Nora paused. She straightened up, holding her empty tray against her side. "Yes, sir. Can I get you anything else?" "Actually, yes." Roman gestured vaguely toward his accountant. "Leo here is having a bit of a crisis. He claims that moving large sums of capital through our, let's call them construction investments, is mathematically impossible right now without raising federal flags." Leo swallowed hard. "Roman, please. This isn't the place—" "Shut up, Leo," Roman said, never taking his eyes off Nora. He offered her a patronizing, razor-thin smile. "I value outside perspectives. You look like a bright girl. What's your name?" "Nora, sir." Nora. He tasted the name, finding it unremarkable. Tell me, Nora, if you had, hypothetically, $12 million in unbanked cash, and you needed to integrate it into a legitimate real estate portfolio without tipping off the IRS, how would you handle the tax drag? The three goons chuckled. Leo wiped his brow, relieved that the crosshairs were temporarily off him. It was a classic bully move. Trap someone in a conversation they can't possibly navigate, watch them squirm, laugh at their ignorance, and dismiss them. Nora stood perfectly still. She looked at the smirking men. She looked at Roman. His posture was relaxed, arrogant. He was waiting for her to blush. He was waiting for her to stutter out an apology, to say, "I don't know anything about that, sir," and scurry away to the kitchen. She was so incredibly tired. Tired of her feet hurting. Tired of eating leftover bread from the busboy station. Tired of men who thought the world belonged to them just because they wore expensive watches. Nora didn't blush. She didn't apologize. She shifted her weight to her right leg, resting her tray against her hip. "Hypothetically?" Nora asked. Her voice was flat, deadpan. Roman's smile widened a fraction. "Hypothetically. Consider it a consultation." "You don't put it in real estate," Nora said. The silence in the room changed. The faint, mocking chuckles from the associates died in their throats. Roman's smile didn't vanish, but it froze. "Excuse me?" Roman said softly. Nora stepped closer to the table. She wasn't looking at him like a terrifying Mafia boss. She was looking at him like a child who had just asked a stupid question in a freshman seminar. "Real estate is slow, and commercial property appraisals are under heavy federal scrutiny right now," Nora said, her voice even and clear. "If you try to buy up properties with cash funneled through a newly formed LLC, the title companies are legally obligated to report the beneficial ownership under the new FinCEN regulations. You'll trip an alert before the ink is dry." Leo's jaw literally dropped. He stared at the waitress as if she had just sprouted a second head. Roman sat up. The lazy arrogance bled out of his posture, replaced by a sudden sharp intensity. "Is that right?" "Yes," Nora said. She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a standard-issue BIC pen. She plucked a thick, embossed paper coaster from beneath Roman's water glass and flipped it over to the blank side. "May I?" she asked. Roman didn't speak. He just nodded once. Nora leaned over the table. She drew 3 quick, jagged boxes on the cardboard. "If you have $12 million in unbanked cash, your problem isn't the tax drag. Your problem is the entry point," she said, tapping the first box. "You're trying to shove a watermelon through a garden hose. You don't need construction investments. You need high-volume, low-margin cash businesses that deal in perishable inventory." "Laundromats," one of the goons muttered. Nora sighed, a brief, highly irritated sound. "No, laundromats are a cliché. The IRS audits coin-operated businesses with a baseline algorithm. If your water bill doesn't match your reported revenue, they freeze your accounts in 48 hours. She drew a line connecting the first box to the second. "You use logistics, specifically short-haul freight or local food distribution. Seafood, produce, cash-intensive, high spoilage rates. You buy a small failing distribution company. You mix the $12 million into the daily operational revenue over a period of 18 months. When a pallet of shrimp spoils and you write it off as a loss, the cash you used to buy it remains in the system. You pay taxes on the inflated profits. Yes, you lose about 22% to corporate tax, but the remaining $9.3 million is spotless." Roman stared at the coaster. The diagram was crude, but the logic was bulletproof. It was elegant. It was exactly what Leo had spent 3 weeks failing to figure out. "But you don't stop there," Nora continued, drawing a third box. You take that clean 9 million and you buy municipal bonds. They yield lower interest, but the interest is tax-exempt at the federal level. You use the bonds as collateral to take out a low-interest bank loan. Now you have 10 million in perfectly legal bank credit, untethered from the original cash. You buy your real estate with the bank's money. The mortgage interest becomes a tax deduction. She capped her pen and dropped it back into her apron. She slid the coaster across the table until it rested directly in front of Roman. That's how you handle the tax drag, sir, hypothetically. The room was so quiet, Nora could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator compressors working 3 rooms away. The heavy-set men were frozen. Leo looked like he was about to vomit. Roman looked at the coaster. Then slowly he raised his eyes to meet hers. The cold, dead boredom was gone. His eyes were burning. It was a look of pure, predatory calculation. It was the look of a man who had just found a diamond lying in the mud. "Where did you learn that?" Roman asked. His voice dropped an octave. It wasn't a threat, but it demanded an immediate answer. "I read a lot." Nora lied smoothly. "You don't read that in a library, Nora. I have tables to clear. Enjoy your oysters. They're best when they're cold." She turned on her heel and walked out of the VIP room, the velvet curtain swishing shut behind her. Back in the kitchen, the heat hit Nora like a physical blow. The clatter of pans, the shouting in Spanish and English, the smell of searing meat. It all rushed back, grounding her. Her heart was hammering against her ribs. Stupid, she thought. So stupid. Why couldn't she just keep her mouth shut? She knew who Roman Castiglione was. Everyone in the city knew who the Castiglione family was, even if they pretended they were just wealthy venture capitalists. You don't show off to a man like that. You don't humiliate his accountant in front of him. But he had looked at her like she was dirt. And for 3 minutes she hadn't been Nora, the exhausted waitress. For 3 minutes she had been Nora Gallagher, top of her cohort at Wharton, before her father's gambling debts caught up with them and forced her to drop out to keep the loan sharks from breaking his legs. She leaned against the stainless steel prep counter, closing her eyes and pressing the heels of her hands against her temples. "Gallagher!" Nora flinched. The floor manager, a high-strung man named David, marched toward her, his face flushed. "What did you do in the VIP room?" David hissed, pulling her aside by the elbow. Nora's stomach dropped. "Nothing. I served the appetizers." Leo just came out sweating through his shirt and demanded the check. They're leaving. They haven't even ordered entrees yet. If you offended Mr. Castiglione, you are done in this city, Nora. Do you understand me? Done. "I didn't offend him," Nora said, though she wasn't entirely sure. David shoved a black leather billfold into her chest. "Clean off their table. If they left a mess, you're scrubbing it. Go." Nora took a deep breath, smoothing her apron, and walked back out to the dining floor. She approached the back room with heavy dread. When she pushed the curtain aside, the room was empty. The air still smelled of expensive cologne and cigar smoke. The oysters were untouched. The wagyu was barely eaten. She walked over to the table and picked up the leather check presenter. She opened it, expecting exact change or a stiffed bill. Inside was a black, heavy-stock business card. No company name, just a phone number printed in silver foil. Beneath the card lay a stack of crisp $100 bills. 10 of them. A $1,000 tip for a plate of appetizers. Nora stared at the money. Her hands shook slightly as she picked up the business card. She turned it over. On the back, written in black ink, was a single sentence. "I pay better than the restaurant." Out on the street, the night air was biting. Roman stood by the open door of a black SUV. His driver waited patiently. Leo and the others had already been dispatched in a separate car, a quiet ride that Roman knew would be filled with Leo's panicked excuses. Roman didn't care about Leo anymore. Leo was obsolete. Roman pulled a cigar from his breast pocket and clipped the end. He didn't light it. He just rolled it between his fingers, looking up at the faintly glowing sign of Bistro Laura. He replayed the last 10 minutes in his head, the way she hadn't flinched. The deadpan, utterly exhausted expression on her face as she explained federal tax law and money laundering better than men who made 6 figures doing it. The crude drawing on the coaster, which was currently resting in his suit pocket. She wasn't just smart. She was deeply, fundamentally angry. Roman recognized the anger because it mirrored his own. It was the anger of someone who knew exactly how the machine worked, but was trapped at the bottom of the gears. His phone vibrated. He pulled it out and pressed it to his ear. "Yeah," Roman said. "Boss, it's Paulie. We secured the warehouse. What do you want to do about Leo?" "Fire him," Roman said casually. "Give him a severance package. Tell him if he ever looks at a ledger again, I'll take his hands." Paulie paused. "Done. We getting a new firm?" "No," Roman said. "I found someone. I need you to pull a background check. Name is Nora. Waitress at Laura. I want everything by tomorrow morning. Financials, family, debts, enemies. Every time she swiped a credit card for the last 5 years. A waitress, Roman. Are you sure?" Roman looked at the restaurant doors. "Just get the file, Paulie." He ended the call and slid into the leather interior of the SUV. The door shut with a heavy, soundproof thud. Roman leaned his head back against the headrest, a genuine smile finally touching his lips. He had gone in looking for a cheap laugh. He walked out with the keys to the kingdom. He just had to figure out how to force her to unlock the door. Morning sunlight did nothing to soften the brutalism of Roman's corner office. It cut through the floor-to-ceiling glass, highlighting the dust motes dancing over the black marble desk. Paulie tossed a thick manila folder onto the polished surface. It landed with a dull, heavy slap. "Everything you asked for," Paulie said. He dropped his bulk into one of the leather visitor chairs, rubbing his jaw. "And boss? You were right. She's not just a waitress, but her situation is a mess. A very expensive, very loud mess." Roman didn't reply immediately. He opened the folder. The top page featured a driver's license photo of Nora Gallagher. She looked younger in the picture, less hollowed out, her eyes lacking the flat, deadpan stare she had leveled at him last night. He started reading. The paper trail was a perfect tragedy, laid out in black ink and negative bank balances. Nora Gallagher, 24, 3 years at the Wharton School of Business. GPA, 3.9. She had been on a fast track to a high-rise hedge fund, destined to wear silk blouses and ruin economies from a comfortable distance. Then, 18 months ago, the record abruptly stopped. Complete withdrawal. No degree. Roman flipped the page. "Arthur Gallagher," he murmured, reading the name of her father. "A degenerate," Paulie supplied, leaning forward. "Used to run a decent plumbing supply business in Southie. Wife died of pancreatic cancer 4 years ago. The medical bills drained the savings, and Arthur decided the best way to recoup the losses was at the card tables. He owes 50 grand to the Bellicosa crew, another 20 to a freelance bookie named Hayes, and he took out a second mortgage that's 3 months in default." Roman scanned the credit reports. Maxed out cards, payday loans. Nora was working 70 hours a week between the bistro and a morning shift at a bakery, bleeding herself dry to pay the interest on debts she didn't accrue. "She's keeping him afloat," Roman noted, his voice devoid of pity. It was an observation of a structural flaw. "Barely. Hayes is losing patience," Paulie said. "Word on the street is he's sending a couple of guys to break Arthur's legs by Friday if he doesn't pony up 10 grand. The girl is drowning, Roman. She's a liability. Why do we want her near the books?" Roman closed the folder. He rested his hands on top of it. He didn't see a liability. He saw leverage. Pure, unadulterated, desperate leverage. People who were comfortable could be bought, and they could just as easily be outbid. But people who were drowning? If you threw them a rope, they belonged to you. Call Hayes. Roman said quietly. Tell him I'm buying Arthur Gallagher's paper. All of it. Pay him a 20% premium for the trouble, and tell him if he ever goes near the old man or the daughter again, I'll have you pull his teeth out with pliers. Paulie blinked, surprised by the sudden escalation, but nodded. And the Bellicosa crew? I'll handle them. Clear the debt by noon. Across the city, in a cramped second-floor apartment that smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and mold, Nora sat at a chipped formica kitchen table. The $1,000 from last night sat in 10 neat piles of 100. It was a fortune to a waitress. It was a cruel joke to a girl whose father owed $80,000 to violent men. The bedroom door clicked open. Arthur shuffled out, wearing sweatpants and a stained undershirt. He looked older than 55. His skin had a greyish, papery quality, and his hands possessed a perpetual fine tremor. He stopped when he saw the money on the table. A familiar, sickening light ignited in his eyes. Nora, sweetie, Arthur said, his voice taking on that wheedling, desperately optimistic tone she despised. Did you get a bonus? Nora didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the money. It's rent, Dad, and it's the minimum payment for the electricity, and maybe enough to keep Hayes from knocking on the door this week. Arthur took a step closer, his eyes locked on the bills. Nora, listen. Jimmy down at the tracks, he gave me a tip. A sure thing. The 7th race? No. Nora finally looked up. Her expression was hard, a protective shell she had spent 2 years perfecting. No, you are not touching this. Just 200, Arthur pleaded, stepping closer. The desperation was pathetic, making him look small and frantic. I can double it. I can fix this, Nora, I promise. I just need a stake. You need help, she said, her voice cracking slightly before she forced it back into a flat line. She swept the money off the table, shoving it into her cheap canvas tote bag. I'm going to the bank. Don't leave the apartment. She walked out, locking the door behind her, the deadbolt snapping into place with a heavy finality. She stood in the dim, peeling hallway of the apartment building, her back pressed against the door. She squeezed her eyes shut. Her hand drifted to the pocket of her coat. Her fingers brushed against the thick, embossed card Roman Castiglione had left her. I pay better than the restaurant. She pulled it out, staring at the silver foil numbers in the dim fluorescent light. She knew exactly what making this call meant. You didn't do tax consulting for the Castiglione family. You aided and abetted. You stepped over a line that could not be uncrossed. But as she listened to her father moving aimlessly around the apartment behind her, a ghost haunting his own ruined life, she realized the line didn't matter anymore. Virtue was a luxury she couldn't afford. She needed capital. Nora pulled out her phone and dialed the number. The address on the card belonged to a sleek, unmarked skyscraper in the financial district. Nora rode the silent, high-speed elevator to the top floor, her stomach tightening with every passing floor. She wore her only suit, a cheap, navy blue polyester blend she had bought at a thrift store for a college interview that felt like a lifetime ago. The elevator doors slid open to reveal a sprawling, minimalist reception area. There was no receptionist, just white marble, glass walls, and an unobstructed view of the grey city skyline. Roman was waiting for her. He sat at the end of a long, custom-built conference table, staring out the window. He wore a dark navy suit today. No tie, the top 2 buttons of his shirt undone. He looked entirely in his element, relaxed, untouchable, and lethal. You're 5 minutes early, Roman said without turning around. The buses were running on schedule. Nora replied, her voice steady as she walked into the room. Her cheap shoes clicked against the marble floor. Roman finally turned. He studied her, his pale grey eyes taking in the ill-fitting suit, the defiant tilt of her chin, the way she clutched her tote bag like a shield. He gestured to the empty chair directly across from him. Sit. Nora sat. She placed her bag on the floor, keeping her hands folded neatly on the table. I'm assuming you didn't leave me $1,000 because you liked the oysters. I left you $1,000 because I wanted your attention, Roman said smoothly. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood. And you called me because you need a lot more than $1,000. Nora's expression didn't change, but her heart gave a hard, erratic thump. I don't know what you're talking about. Roman reached beside him and slid a thin grey folder across the long table. It spun perfectly, stopping exactly in front of her. Arthur Gallagher, Roman said. The name hit the air like a physical blow. $82,000 in the hole, 30 of it to legitimate creditors, 52 to street guys who don't care about consumer protection laws. Hayes was going to send someone to your apartment tomorrow. Nora stared at the folder. She didn't open it. The air in the room felt suddenly thin. She wanted to stand up, to yell at him, to walk out. But the cold, terrible weight of reality kept her pinned to the chair. How did you get this? She asked softly. I have resources, Roman said. I also have the paper. I bought it this morning, all of it. Nora's head snapped up. Her eyes met his, wide and suddenly furious. You bought my father's debt? I consolidated it, Roman corrected, a faint, dangerous smile playing on his lips. Hayes is out. Bellacosa is out. The mortgage is current. As of 10 a.m. today, Arthur Gallagher owes exactly $82,000 to me. Silence descended on the room. It was thick and suffocating. Nora looked at the man across the table. He wasn't playing a game anymore. He had meticulously boxed her in, cutting off every escape route before she even knew she was being hunted. Why? Nora demanded. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the sharp edge of a razor. Because I have a $12 million liquidity problem, Roman stated simply. And my current accountant is a coward who thinks small. I don't like people who think small, Nora. I want the distribution company set up you pitched last night. I want the municipal bonds. I want the clean real estate. So you bought me. I made an investment. Nora let out a harsh, bitter laugh. This isn't an investment. It's a hostage situation. You hold my father's legs over my head, and I launder your blood money. That's the deal, isn't it? Roman's smile vanished. The sudden coldness in his eyes made Nora realize exactly who she was talking to. This wasn't an arrogant frat boy. This was a man who ordered violence as easily as he ordered coffee. Don't flatter yourself, Roman said, his voice dropping to a low, quiet hum that vibrated in the air. If I wanted a slave, I could find one. I want a partner, someone who understands the mechanics of money. You're angry, Nora. You're angry that you're smart enough to rule the world, but you're scrubbing tables because of someone else's weakness. He stood up and walked slowly around the table, his steps making no sound. He stopped beside her chair, looking down at her. Here is my offer, Roman said. You work for me. You build the infrastructure. You manage the flow. I pay you $300,000 a year, legitimate salary, routed through a consulting firm. You pay off your father's debt to me from your earnings, at 0% interest. When the debt is clear, you can walk away, or you can stay. Nora stared straight ahead. A legitimate salary, $300,000 a year. It was more money than she had ever seen. It was freedom. It was a golden cage, but it was still gold. And if I refuse, she asked, her voice tight. I sell the debt back to Hayes, Roman said casually, with a late fee attached. It wasn't a choice. They both knew it. Nora finally reached out and opened the grey folder. Inside were the promissory notes, the mortgage transfers, the gambling markers. Her father's life, neatly stapled and categorized. She closed the folder. She took a slow, deep breath, forcing the panic down into a tight little box in her chest. If she was going to do this, she wouldn't be a victim. She wouldn't be Leo, sweating and stammering. She turned her head to look up at Roman. The proximity was startling. She could smell his cologne, bergamot and something dark like cedar. If I do this, Nora said, her tone suddenly shifting. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, pragmatic steel. I'd do it my way. No interference from your street guys. No thugs trying to tell me how to run a ledger. If I need a company bought, you buy it. If I fire someone, they stay fired. Roman's eyebrows rose slightly. He had expected tears. He had expected pleading. The aggressive counter-demand sent a sudden, unexpected jolt of adrenaline through him. You want total control of the financial division? He asked. I want control of the pieces I'm building, Nora corrected. I don't care where the cash comes from. That's your business. But once it hits my desk, it's my ecosystem. You don't touch it without my permission. Roman stared at her. The sheer audacity of a waitress demanding autonomy from the head of the Castiglione family was staggering. It was also incredibly, dangerously appealing. Deal, Roman said. He held out his hand. Nora looked at his large, manicured hand. She reached up and gripped it. His grip was firm, warm, and absolute. Where do we start? Nora asked. The smell hit her before the car even parked. It was a pungent, thick wall of brine, dead fish, and diesel exhaust. Nora stepped out of the black SUV, pulling her cheap navy coat tighter around herself against the cutting wind coming off the harbor. Roman stepped out of the other side. He looked entirely out of place on the damp, cracked concrete of the commercial docks, his charcoal suit a stark contrast to the rusted, corrugated metal of the warehouses. Atlantic Crest Seafood, Roman said, gesturing to the sprawling, dilapidated building in front of them. The painted sign above the loading bays was peeling, the letters barely legible. We acquired it 2 days ago. It's operating at a net loss of $40,000 a month. The logistics are a nightmare, the fleet is aging, and the inventory spoilage is astronomical. Perfect, Nora said flatly. She started walking toward the main office doors, not waiting for him. Roman watched her go for a second, a faint smirk playing on his lips, before following. Inside, the warehouse was a chaotic, wet mess. Men in heavy rubber boots and aprons were shouting over the roar of forklifts and industrial ice machines. Water pooled on the concrete floor, slick with fish scales and grease. Nora bypassed the floor entirely, heading straight for the metal stairs that led to the elevated glass-enclosed management office overlooking the floor. She pushed the door open without knocking. The office was cramped and smelled like stale coffee and cigars. A heavy-set man with a thick beard and a stained shirt was sitting with his boots up on a cluttered desk, reading a sports betting sheet. He looked up, scowling at the intrusion. "Who the hell are you? Read the sign, sweetheart. No unauthorized—" He stopped abruptly as Roman walked in behind her. The man's face instantly drained of color. He scrambled to his feet, knocking over a half-empty mug of coffee. "Mr. Castiglione," the man stammered, frantically wiping the spilled coffee with his sleeve. I didn't know you were coming down." "Sit down, Miller," Roman said, leaning against the doorframe. He crossed his arms. "I'm just observing today. Miss Gallagher is taking over operations." Miller looked at Nora, his confusion obvious. He took in her youth, her cheap suit, her lack of physical intimidation. A sneer started to form on his lips, emboldened by the fact that she was just a girl. Operations? Miller scoffed. Look, no offense, Mr. Castiglione, but this is a tough doc. You can't put some college kid in charge of these guys. They won't listen to her. The supply chains are complicated. Shut up, Nora said. The command wasn't loud. It wasn't shouted. It was delivered with such flat, absolute boredom that Miller actually snapped his mouth shut. Nora walked over to the desk. She ignored Miller completely. She picked up a stack of grimy invoices and flipped through them quickly. She opened a filing cabinet, pulled out a thick ledger, and dropped it onto the desk. The dust flew up in a small cloud. She opened the ledger. Her eyes darted down the columns, her mind instantly shifting into a gear that Roman had seen briefly at the restaurant, but was now witnessing at full speed. You're reporting a 30% spoilage rate on Atlantic cod, Nora said, not looking up from the book. Yeah, Miller said, trying to regain his footing. The refrigeration units on the trucks are old. They break down. The ice melts. It's unavoidable. It's a lie, Nora said casually. She flipped to another page. Your fuel receipts don't match the mileage for local delivery. You're logging trips to distribution centers in Connecticut, but the tolls charged to the company Easy'd Pass accounts only show local Boston routes. Miller swallowed hard. I can explain that. The drivers, they take back roads to avoid traffic. Nora finally looked up. Her eyes were dead. You're selling the prime catch off the books to local restaurants for cash, claiming it's spoiled in transit, and using the fuel budget to cover the mileage discrepancy. You're stealing from the company. Miller's face flushed a dark, angry red. He took a step toward her, trying to use his physical size to intimidate her. Listen here, you little bitch. You don't know nothing about how this business works. Before Miller could take another step, Roman moved. It was terrifyingly fast. 1 second he was leaning against the doorframe. The next he had Miller pinned against the filing cabinet by his throat. Roman's face was inches from Miller's. The civilized, wealthy air was gone, replaced by the apex predator. Don't speak to her like that, Roman whispered. The softness of his voice made it infinitely more violent. Miller gagged, his hand scrabbling uselessly at Roman's iron grip. Nora didn't flinch. She watched the violence with a detached, clinical eye. Roman, she said quietly. Roman didn't look at her. He stole from us. I know, Nora said, but you can't kill him. I need his signature to transfer the LLC banking authorizations, and a dead manager triggers a state labor investigation. Roman held Miller for a second longer, letting the man feel the absolute certainty of his own death before releasing him. Miller collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, clutching his bruised throat. Roman straightened his suit jacket, turning back to Nora as if nothing had happened. Your call. Nora looked down at the gasping man on the floor. You're fired, Miller. You have 10 minutes to clear out your desk. If I ever see you on this dock again, or if any of the books suddenly go missing, I won't stop him next time. Miller scrambled to his feet, tripping over his own boots in his desperation to get out of the office. The door slammed behind him. Nora let out a slow breath. Her hands were shaking slightly, but she quickly hid them by gripping the edge of the desk. She looked at the chaotic ledger in front of her. 12 million. Nora murmured. Excuse me? Roman asked, stepping closer. Nora grabbed a pen. You need 12 million washed. This place is perfect. It's a disaster. The accounting is so fractured the IRS wouldn't know where to start. We create a secondary set of books for the spoiled inventory. We inflate the purchase orders by 30%, funnel the warehouse cash into the inflated accounts payable to dummy shell companies, and bring it back as legitimate revenue. Roman watched her, the way her eyes moved, the sharp, relentless speed of her mind. She wasn't just smart, she was a weapon, and she was holding the gun steady, aiming it right at the system that had crushed her. "How long?" Roman asked. "To set up the structure? 2 weeks." Nora said, aggressively crossing out a column in Miller's ledger. "To integrate the full 12? 18 months. But I need new software, and I need a driver I can trust to move the actual cash." "You'll have whatever you need," Roman said. He stood beside her, looking out the glass window down at the wet, noisy warehouse floor. He had brought her to fix a math problem, but as he looked at the hard, unyielding profile of the woman beside him, Roman Castigliones realized he had made a severe miscalculation. He thought he was the one pulling the strings. But Nora Gallagher was already rebuilding the entire machine. The city outside the glass walls of Roman's office had turned into a blur of driving sleet, the kind of miserable February night that kept everyone indoors. Inside, the only light came from the glow of 2 high-definition monitors and the dim amber reading lamp on the mahogany desk. It had been 8 months. Nora didn't wear cheap polyester anymore. She wore tailored wool trousers and silk blouses in muted, anonymous colors. She still wore her hair pulled back, but the dark circles under her eyes had shifted. They were no longer the bruises of a victim drowning in debt. They were the exhaustion of a general fighting a multi-front war. She stood in front of a massive glass whiteboard, a black dry erase marker squeaking aggressively against the surface. Roman sat on the leather sofa in the shadows, a glass of bourbon in his hand. He hadn't spoken in an hour. He was just watching her work. It had become a strange, unspoken ritual between them. When the street operations quieted down past midnight, Roman came up to the financial floor, and they existed in this quiet, intense vacuum. "The volume is too high for the current injection rate," Nora said, her voice raspy from lack of sleep. She tapped the marker against the glass. "If we push another million through Atlantic Crest this quarter, the revenue spike is going to fall outside the standard deviation for the regional seafood market. We're pushing the limit on plausible spoilage." "So we buy another company," Roman said from the dark. "We don't have the runway to establish the baseline accounting for a new acquisition before tax season," Nora replied, turning around. "We need to modulate the cash flow into the existing structure using continuous integration, not lump sums. We need to calculate the exact present value of the daily cash injection against the decay rate of the unbanked capital due to inflation, maximizing the threshold before it triggers an algorithmic audit." She turned back to the board. Her handwriting was sharp and jagged. She began mapping the flow, writing out the continuous cash flow formula to demonstrate the exact limit they could push through the accounts. PV equals integral from 0 to TC of TE to the power of minus RT dt. If C of T is our daily cash injection rate, and R is the inflation decay, we integrate over the period T of 18 months. Nora muttered, filling the board with variables. "We cap the daily injection precisely at the point where the derivative of our reported revenue matches the historical seasonal growth of the business. We don't hide the money. We make the money look boring." Roman stood up. He walked over to the glass board, the ice in his glass clinking softly. He didn't look at the math. He looked at her. "You haven't slept in 2 days," Roman said. "I sleep fine. You sleep on the sofa in the break room for 3 hours, and then you drink black coffee until your hands shake." Roman reached out and took the marker from her fingers. She didn't resist, but her jaw tightened. "The money is moving, Nora. We are 6 months ahead of schedule. You don't need to kill yourself to prove you can do it." Nora crossed her arms. "I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm executing the job." "You're executing it ruthlessly." Roman took a step closer. The scent of bergamot and cedar invaded her space, anchoring her suddenly racing thoughts. Paulie tells me you authorized the buyout of a competing logistics firm in South Boston yesterday. They were undercutting Atlantic Crest's shipping rates to drive us out of the route, Nora said defensively. I looked at their debt-to-equity ratio. They were over-leveraged. I bought their commercial loans through a blind trust and called the debt in early. They either folded into us or went bankrupt. Roman's lips curved into a slow, dangerous smile. You bought their debt and squeezed them. Nora paused. She looked away, staring at the polished floor. The realization of what she had done sat heavy in her chest. She had used the exact same tactic on a family-owned trucking company that Roman had used on her. It was the most efficient solution, she said quietly. It was a bloodbath, Roman corrected. His voice was low, laced with a dark, profound respect. It was beautiful. But it was a bloodbath. He set his glass down on the edge of the conference table. He looked at the harsh tension in her shoulders, the way she held herself like she was constantly preparing for a blow. Arthur called the front desk today, Roman said, shifting the subject abruptly. Nora went rigid. I told reception to block his number. They did. He left a voicemail. He wanted to know if you could front him 2,000. Said it was a medical emergency. It's not, Nora said, her voice turning completely hollow. He found a new bookie operating out of an auto body shop in Dorchester. He's betting on college basketball. Roman watched her face. He saw the flicker of old pain, the phantom weight of the anchor that had dragged her down for years. Do you want me to handle it? He asked. It wasn't a threat toward her. It was a genuine offer of violence on her behalf. A quiet removal of a problem. Nora shook her head. No, the debt you hold over him is the only thing keeping him from totally drowning. Let him spin his wheels. I don't care anymore. She looked up, meeting Roman's pale grey eyes. For the first time in 8 months, the barrier between them fractured. She wasn't the hostage. He wasn't the captor. They were two architects standing in a house they were building out of dirty money and pure ambition. Roman reached out, his thumb brushing a smudge of black, dry erase ink from the edge of her jaw. His touch was warm, shockingly gentle for a man who ordered men beaten for rounding errors. Go home, Nora, Roman said softly. The math will be here tomorrow. Nora didn't move away from his hand. She just closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, letting out a long, shaky breath. Okay. The ecosystem Nora built was flawless, but human greed was always the unpredictable variable. The variable arrived in late August in the form of Richard Harrison. Harrison was the regional director of commercial lending for the municipal bank, where Nora had parked the first $5 million of washed cash. He was a man who wore suits that were a little too expensive for his salary and reeked of cheap confidence. They met in the private dining room of a steakhouse downtown. Nora sat on one side of the table, a pristine spreadsheet open on her tablet. Roman sat beside her, radiating a quiet, terrifying stillness. Harrison sat across from them, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. It's a very impressive portfolio, Miss Gallagher, Harrison said, his eyes lingering on her a little too long before flicking nervously to Roman. The municipal bonds, the real estate acquisitions through the Shell LLCs, Atlantic Crest is suddenly very liquid. We've optimized our supply chains, Nora said flatly. The profit margins reflect the restructuring. Harrison chuckled. It was an ugly, wet sound. Of course. Optimization. Look, I've been in banking for 30 years. I know what an inflated ledger looks like. You're running street cash through a fish market and parking it in my vault. Roman didn't move, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Choose your next words with extreme care, Richard. Harrison swallowed heavily, the bravado slipping for a second, but his greed won out. I'm a team player, Mr. Castiglione, but facilitating this level of capital integration exposes me to personal federal risk. I feel a consultation fee is appropriate. 5% of the total volume deposited, paid quarterly into an offshore account, I will provide. Nora didn't blink. She looked at Harrison the way she had looked at the spoiled fish at the warehouse. 5%. Nora repeated. It's a bargain for peace of mind. Harrison said, leaning back, trying to look comfortable. Roman reached inside his jacket. Nora knew he wasn't reaching for a pen. Under the table, Nora placed her hand over Roman's wrist. She gripped it hard. Roman froze, looking at her sharply. She didn't look at him. She kept her eyes locked on Harrison. No, Nora said. Harrison frowned. No, no, Nora repeated. She tapped a few keys on her tablet, brought up a document, and turned the screen around to face the banker. This is a forensic routing summary, Nora said, her voice dropping into that chilling, deadpan cadence. 2 weeks ago, anticipating your concerns, I set up an automated clearinghouse transfer protocol within your bank's internal software. I didn't just deposit our money into your vault, Richard. I funneled a portion of our unbanked cash directly through your personal executive equity account before routing it back into the municipal bonds. Harrison's face went completely white. He stared at the screen. Right now, Nora continued, leaning forward. There is a digital paper trail showing that you personally authorized the laundering of $2 million. If you trigger an audit on us, the feds will see that you were the entry point. You won't just lose your job. You will go to federal prison for conspiracy and wire fraud. And because the cartels track federal informants in those prisons, you probably won't survive your first year. Harrison was shaking. A fine sheen of sweat broke out on his forehead. You can't do that. That's illegal. So is extortion, Nora said. She pulled the tablet back. You don't get 5%. You get your standard banking salary, and you approve every single loan application I send across your desk within 24 hours. If you ever ask for a bribe again, I will anonymously forward this routing data to the SEC. Harrison stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He didn't say a word. He just turned and practically ran out of the private room. Silence settled over the table, broken only by the faint clatter of silverware from the main dining room. Roman slowly pulled his hand out of his jacket. He turned in his chair to face her. The look in his eyes was something Nora had never seen before. It wasn't just respect. It was absolute, undeniable hunger. You routed our cash through his personal accounts? Roman asked. No, Nora said, taking a sip of her water. I mocked up a fake routing summary on a private server, but he doesn't know how to code, so he believed it. Roman stared at her. A low, dark laugh rumbled in his chest, vibrating in the quiet room. You bluffed a federal banker with a fake spreadsheet. I calculated his risk tolerance. Nora corrected, though a faint, genuine smile finally broke through her composed exterior. He's a coward. Cowards don't verify, they panic. Roman reached across the table. He didn't grab her wrist this time. He laced his fingers through hers. His hand was hot, large, and calloused from a life she only saw the sanitized edges of. You realize, Roman said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper, that you are the most terrifying thing I have ever brought into this family. You brought me to fix your math, Nora said, her pulse jumping against his palm. I'm fixing it. You're fixing everything, he murmured. He pulled her hand slightly, forcing her to lean across the table. He leaned in, closing the distance between them. There was no romance in it, no soft declarations. It was a collision of two people who had found the exact same darkness in each other. Roman kissed her. It was hard, demanding, and tasted of bourbon and danger. Nora didn't pull back. She kissed him back with all the repressed anger and exhaustion she had carried for 2 years, her free hand gripping the lapel of his expensive suit. When they finally broke apart, the air in the room was electric, heavy with a new, irreversible reality. Roman looked at her, his breathing slightly shallow. When the 18 months are up, when the ledger is clean, what about it? Nora asked, her voice unsteady. You're not leaving. Roman started. It wasn't a question. Nora looked at the tablet on the table, at the empire she had painstakingly dragged out of the mud and turned into gold. No, she said softly. I'm not. The 18th month ended on a Tuesday in late October. A sharp, biting wind whipped off the harbour, rattling the thick glass of the high-rise windows. Inside the executive financial suite, the temperature was a perfectly controlled 68 degrees. Nora sat alone at the head of the long conference table. The only sound in the room was the soft, rhythmic hum of the servers down the hall and the frantic clicking of her own keyboard. She didn't look at the city skyline. She didn't look at her cold cup of black coffee. Her eyes were locked entirely on the cascading rows of data filling her monitor. She executed the final algorithmic sweep. It was a localized audit script she had written herself, designed to aggressively comb through 32 different accounts, shell companies, dummy logistics fronts, and municipal holdings, searching for a single federal red flag. The progress bar crawled across the screen. 98%, 99, 100. The screen flashed. A single unified number populated at the bottom of the master ledger, glowing in a harsh, bright green against the black background. $12,045,000. It was done. The impossible math problem was solved. The cash that had once sat molding in a damp basement, a massive liability waiting to trigger a RICO case, was now fully integrated, tax-compliant equity. It sat quietly in commercial real estate portfolios, high-yield municipal bonds, and the operating capital of 3 legitimate shipping companies. The tax drag had been mitigated to a mere 14% overall loss, a margin so tight it was practically a rounding error in Roman's world. Nora slowly pulled her hands away from the keyboard. Her fingers were stiff. She let out a breath she felt like she had been holding for a year and a half. The heavy oak door to the office clicked open. Roman walked in. He wore a black suit, no tie, his collar unbuttoned against the column of his throat. He looked exhausted, the kind of deep, bone-weary fatigue that came from managing a violent empire on the streets while she managed it on paper. But his posture was perfectly straight. He held a thick grey folder in his right hand. It was the exact same folder he had slid across this very table 18 months ago. He didn't say a word. He walked the length of the room, stopping at the edge of the table. He set the folder down precisely in front of her keyboard. The internal audit is clean, Nora said, her voice sounding raspy, foreign in the quiet room. She looked up at him. The cash is fully washed. The infrastructure is permanent. You can push up to 2.5 million a month through the existing pipelines indefinitely without tripping a banking alert. Roman didn't look at the glowing green number on her monitor. He tapped the thick cardstock of the grey folder. Open it, he said. Nora hesitated. Her pulse spiked, a sudden sharp thud of old adrenaline. She reached out, her fingertips brushing the edge of the cardboard. She flipped the cover open. Inside lay the original promissory notes, the gambling markers from the Bellicosa crew, the second mortgage on the cramped Southie apartment, the debts that had choked the life out of her, that had forced her out of Wharton and into a diner apron. But the paper looked different now. Across the face of every single document, stamped in heavy, bleeding red ink, were 3 words: paid in full. Nora stared at the red ink. It was so bright it almost hurt her eyes. She carefully lifted the stack of cancelled debts. Beneath them lay a cashier's check made out to Nora Gallagher. The amount was $500,000. Your final salary payout, Roman said quietly, stepping back, putting a deliberate physical distance between them. Plus a performance bonus. Arthur is clear. I had Paulie visit every bookie in the tri-state area. Your father has been permanently blacklisted from every table, track, and underground game on the East Coast. If anyone takes a dime from him, they answer to me. He's safe. And he's your problem to manage now, or ignore entirely. Nora picked up the cashier's check. The paper felt heavy, loaded with a terrifying, absolute finality. The contract is complete. Roman continued, his voice utterly devoid of its usual commanding edge. It was stripped bare, neutral. You owe me nothing. I owe you nothing. The elevator is unlocked. You can walk out of this building, cash that check, and go back to Wharton. You have the capital. No one from my organization will ever contact you again. Nora looked at the check. Then she looked at the cancelled debts. For 2 years, freedom was the only thing she had dreamed of. The ability to walk down a street without checking over her shoulder for men with baseball bats. The chance to sit in a pristine classroom and learn economic theory without worrying if the electricity would be shut off when she got home. She pictured Wall Street. She pictured the sterile, glass-walled hedge funds she had once desperately wanted to work for. Men in Brooks Brothers suits trading derivatives, hiding behind federal regulations and legal loopholes. They were the exact same men who had allowed her father to leverage his life away on margins. They were just a different kind of mafia. A boring, compliant mafia. Nora didn't want to be a compliant gear in someone else's machine. She looked at her monitor. She looked at the $12 million empire she had built from scratch, forged in the mud and the blood and the stress of the docks. She loved the machine. She owned the machine. Nora closed the grey folder. She picked up the entire stack of documents, the mortgage, the gambling markers, the red stamped proof of her victimization. She pushed her chair back, stood up, and walked over to the corner of the office, where a heavy steel industrial paper shredder sat plugged into the wall. She hit the power button. The machine hummed to life. Without breaking eye contact with Roman, Nora fed the entire folder into the metal teeth. The shredder whirred aggressively, chewing up the past. It reduced her father's failures and her own indentured servitude to tiny, meaningless strips of confetti. Roman watched her. He stood perfectly still, but the muscles in his jaw locked so tight they looked ready to snap. He had never been a man who begged. He took what he wanted. But he knew that forcing her to stay would destroy the very brilliance he admired. He was holding his breath, waiting for her verdict. The shredder finished its meal and fell silent. Nora left the $500,000 check sitting abandoned on the conference table. She walked across the polished marble floor, bypassing her chair entirely. She stepped directly into Roman's space, stopping inches from his chest. She looked up into his pale grey eyes. The exhausted, cynical waitress was gone. The woman standing before him was a predator in her own right. A hedge fund would be entirely too boring, Nora said. The tension holding Roman together shattered completely. A slow, brilliant, dangerous smile broke across his face, entirely altering his sharp features. He reached out, his large hands gripping her waist, pulling her flush against his chest with a fierce, possessive strength. We have an offshore account in the Caymans that requires immediate restructuring, Roman murmured, his voice dropping to a rough gravel, his lips brushing against her temple. It's a total disaster. Nora wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her hands in the dark hair at the nape of his neck. The scent of bergamot, cedar, and cold night air was the only home she wanted. Give me the ledger. she whispered. Thank you so much for diving into this dark, intense journey with Roman and Nora. If you loved watching a brilliant, cynical woman outsmart the criminal underworld and build an empire from scratch, hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to share this story with anyone who loves a gritty, grounded romance where the heroine relies on her intellect, not just her heart. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next full-length audio drama. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment of Nora's ruthless brilliance? See you next time.